In the previous video, we have seen an example that shows that progressive income taxes can be inefficient compared to other types of taxes, in that case a flat tax. But then the question comes, well, why would we have them to begin with? If they create such a disincentive to work more for high income earners and are linked to such great welfare losses, why do we have them? Well, one reason is obviously that they are important for income redistribution. And if society places a high value on that, on income redistribution, then society may also be happy to incur those efficiency costs. But there is also another reason, which is that it may not necessarily be the case that it's actually as inefficient as the previous example has shown. And the reason for that is that if the labor supply of high wage earners is less elastic than that of low wage earners, it may actually be more efficient than other taxes. So think about it the following way. So suppose you have a supply curve that is very, very steep. So we have very inelastic supply. So it's almost vertical. It's not quite vertical, but almost. So we have the wage here and employment here. And now consider a change in wages that could be the result of a tax, right? So if you have a change in wages that looks a bit like that, we go from here to there. So from W1 to W2, we go down here. The response in employment is actually quite small. Or you could even think of a more extreme example whereby that curve is even steeper. So it's almost vertical. And in that case, if we go from here to here, the change in employment would be very, very small. Yeah? And now you can imagine that in this scenario, the welfare loss is very, very small. Why? Well, because the welfare loss comes from workers' consumption and leisure trade-off. So workers, if their net wage gets reduced due to taxation, may do something else instead. Have more leisure, take a different type of job, work fewer hours, because leisure is relatively less expensive now. Yeah? But if their supply curve looks like the one we see here and is very, very steep, then even if their wage decreases a lot, this will not change the number of hours they work. Right? And so now if you think about high wage earners, oftentimes prime aged, in many cases men, but thankfully also more and more women, who just work, and I wouldn't say no matter what their wage is, but whose labor supply wouldn't be so responsive to taxation. If it's not so responsive, there's also not much of a welfare loss. Yeah? And if that's the case, so suppose if these were the high income earners and these were the low income earners, or for low income earners, we would even have a supply curve that is even flatter, so they would react more. In that case, that can actually be, progressive income taxation can actually be efficient. So this is something important to keep in mind. So in other words, those behavioral responses of workers to taxes are very, very important when we want to think about optimal taxation. Now, let's look at this with a very prominent theory that goes back to the 1980s to an economist named Arthur Laffer, who is known probably only for one thing, but that was a very powerful one, namely the so-called Laffer curve. So Laffer was part of a member of the Council of Economic Advisors under Ronald Reagan. And at the time, the impression of many economists and especially also of the political right, of the Republicans, was that taxes in the US are too high. So people have no incentive to work or to work hard or to do better in life because any additional income that they get gets taxed away, right? And so then they needed a model that tells you, okay, how much is the tax revenue and to what extent does it depend on the tax rate? And what happens if we lower the tax rate or raise it? And so allegedly, Laffer wrote this on a napkin. And so it had to be so simple that everyone could understand it. That was the idea behind it. So let's look at this for a second. So the tax revenue, very trivially, is zero if the tax rate is zero, right? If people earn income and you don't tax them, you don't get any revenue. But what's interesting is if we have the behavioral responses that we assume, if people are taxed 100%, so all their income that they get, any additional dollar they earn goes to the taxman, they will not work at all, or they will not work any more than they currently do. Right? Whereas if even their first dollar they earn is taxed at 100%, they won't work at all. So what does this mean? If we tax people's income at 100%, well, then we are not getting any revenue because people will simply refuse to work. And then in between, there is somewhere in the middle is a sweet spot where the tax revenue is maximized. Okay, anywhere on what is here called the wrong side of the Laffer curve, we have a situation where the tax rate is so high that people, if we move towards that high tax rate, people reduce their labor supply, so they work less, have more leisure, and we actually have less tax revenue. So that the higher we go with our tax rate, the lower does the tax revenue get. And we are on what's here called the correct side, somewhere like here. If we start out at that point and we raise taxes, people may reduce their labor supply, but the effect on tax revenues is positive up until a certain point. Okay, up until that point up here. Now, no economist would dispute this point here, and hardly any economist would also dispute that point here. Where the dispute lies until this day between different political camps is where does that sweet spot lie? And under Reagan in the 1980s, what their reasoning was we are currently here, so in point A or in point B, somewhere here, and we should actually be in point C here, and point C is a very low tax rate. Nowadays, most economists say that probably the point C is a lot higher than what the current income tax rates in the US actually are. Right? But if you follow the debate about income taxation, especially in the US, there is, economic arguments are part of the debate, but there are also a lot of political arguments about, a big government, and you want to try and keep the government involvement as small as possible, and free markets and so on. And so then a lot of people will argue that point C is a lot lower. So if we reduce taxes even further, that's actually better for the economy. The problem from a practical perspective here is estimating where point C lies actually not easy. The reason being that if we observe, so we never observe extreme changes in taxes. And so if I see someone who has a relatively low income or a middle class income and is currently taxed at a marginal rate of 20%, I may know what that person would do if the tax rate was 15 or 25%, but I have no idea what that person would do if the tax rate was 70%, because we never observe such big changes in tax rates. So we can always only understand changes in behavior from those small changes in tax rates. And therefore, we cannot really trace out this Laffer curve from the data we observe for an entire workforce. And we can only, approximate it. And there the consensus seems to be that currently the top income tax rates in the US are actually too low. So we could actually have more tax revenue if they actually raise taxes. Now, if we want to then design an optimal tax system, we need to factor a few things in. So the one is what's called vertical equity, which is that we want to tax people who have a higher income at a higher rate than people with a lower income. One of the reasons why we want to do this is obviously out of a sense for justice. There's only so much that effort and your own decisions can bring you ahead in terms of your income, but a lot of it is also beyond people's control, right? It's basically like a lottery. You're born into a certain family, you have a certain talent, you have certain health predispositions and so on, and all these things determine whether you're a high or a low earner. Yeah, and so there is only a certain fraction of your income that is actually explained by how much effort you put into it and so on, but there is also a huge component of luck or things that are beyond your control. And so if that's the case, we obviously would want to tax people who were lucky in this lottery more than others. That's one argument for vertical equity. The other is that if you think about the utility curve, so if you have income here and utility here, then this curve is most likely concave. So for a person who starts out with a low income, somewhere here, an additional euro of income or an additional 1,000 euro make a much bigger difference to their utility than to a person who already has a lot. So that curve is very flat. So this is what we know as the decreasing marginal utility. So if we rather want to have it as the marginal utility as a function of wages, we would have some sort of downward sloping curve. Now, the people who have a low income are those for whom an additional euro of income in their pocket makes a greater difference than the people who already have a high income. Right? That's what that downward sloping marginal utility curve tells us. Right? So if you are here, then an additional euro in your pocket has a higher effect on your utility than if you are here. And now think about a social planner. If a social planner, even if they have utilitarian social preferences, it means here that the utility increase that you get when you tax high income earners more and low income earners less is greater than when you tax everyone equally. Because the marginal utility is higher. Okay, so what I should try and do is to leave more in the pockets of low income earners because they have a greater marginal utility from any euro that's left in their pocket, and leave less in the pockets of high income earners because they have a low marginal utility to begin with. So that's also what's behind vertical equity. So that we need to figure out. but we also need to figure out what those behavioral responses are. Okay, so how do workers respond to changes in taxation? And once we have that, we can then apply a rule that we already encountered, which is the Ramsey Rule, because the Ramsey Rule actually helps us here. So here, the goal is not necessarily to maximize, but the goal here can again be to reduce the deadweight loss. But this here also factors in the utility gain that any particular group in the population has from being taxed more or less. And what the Ramsey Rule tells us here is that each group should be taxed such that the relation between the marginal utility, so the gain they have from having more in their pocket, relative to the additional revenue gain or loss for the exchequer, that is equalized across groups. Right? Now this sounds abstract. I fully admit that. So let's look at a graphical example. So this is again from Gruber's book. Here what has been traced out is the marginal utility and relative to marginal revenue on the left-hand side. Or sorry, on the vertical axis versus the tax rate on the horizontal axis. So let's think for a second what that means. Okay, so why is the curve for the low income earners, who's called Miss Poor here, why is that higher than the one for the high income earner, and why is it upward sloping? So it's higher because the marginal utility for that person, for the low income earner, is higher from what I've shown 2 slides ago. And so that's why the numerator for any tax rate, the numerator is higher for the low income earner than for the high income earner. Now, why is it upward sloping? That's because as the tax rate goes up, the marginal revenue goes down, and so that's the denominator, and so the curve is upward sloping. Now, what the Ramsey Rule tells us then is that we should, in the optimum, tax each person differently, but tax them such that this ratio between the utility gain they have from an increase in revenue is equalized across people. Okay? So if I have one group where the utility gain for an additional euro in tax revenue is greater than for another, then I actually have some scope for more redistribution. Okay? Because then I would probably tax that group that has the higher utility gain a little bit more, and the other group a little bit less. And that would maximize the tax revenue for a given level of efficiency, or minimize the loss of efficiency for a given tax revenue. These are 2 sides of the same coin. But what does this mean here? It means that at a given level of utility gain, or a €1 increase in the tax revenue, we would tax the poor person at 10% and the rich person at 20%. So this is an example for the design of optimal income taxation. So we have to balance here 2 things: behavioral responses, which means as taxes go higher, labor supply goes down, and vertical equity, which means the marginal utility of, so the additional utility you get from an additional euro that is in your pockets is higher when you're poor than when you're rich, right? And so for that reason, we should tax people who are lower income earners. We should tax them less than high income earners. And when we balance those two things, we arrive at the Ramsey Rule, and that tells us to then tax them according to this ratio. Once again, what is that ratio? We want to equalize the utility gain that people get for a €1 increase in revenue. Okay? And we achieve that by taxing high income earners more than low income earners. And that's exactly the characteristic of a progressive income tax system.